Good evening, and welcome back to the Sleepy History channel. Tonight, we're not just reading history, we're peering through the veils of time into a realm where the quiet omens hidden in wind and water and the fragile balance between danger and survival quietly shaped the world. We'll be exploring the fascinating world of the seafaring world of medieval sailors who faced deadly waters, uncovering stories that time almost forgot. Before we begin, may I take a quiet moment to reach out to you? Where in the world are you listening from tonight? Whether it's late in the evening or the start of a new day, I'm truly grateful to share a few calm minutes of your time. I always look forward to reading your comments. Hearing where you are and how these stories reach you truly inspires me. Your words often become the spark that shapes the next episode. If you're enjoying these gentle journeys through history, feel free to subscribe or share your ideas for future topics. Your voice helps keep this little corner of history alive and this community growing. So now, get comfortable, settle in, and let the quiet echoes of the cold, unpredictable seas of medieval Europe carry you away. Our journey begins where the North Sea reveals its unforgiving nature to those who dare to sail it. Now, let's begin. The North Sea alone claimed countless vessels each year, its icy waters and sudden squalls turning routine fishing expeditions into desperate battles for survival. But the sailors who worked these waters weren't just lucky. They were master survivalists who understood their environment with an intimacy born of necessity. They read the sky like scripture, interpreted the behavior of seabirds as divine omens, and developed an almost supernatural ability to sense approaching danger hours before it materialized. Consider the plight of a typical fishing crew setting out from an English coastal village in the depths of winter. Their vessel, perhaps 30 feet of oak planking held together with iron nails and sealed with pitch, would have seemed laughably inadequate to modern eyes. No radar, no radio, no weather forecasts, just hemp rope, canvas sails, and the accumulated knowledge of generations who had learned to read the sea's moods through bitter experience. These men possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of wind patterns, understanding how the slightest shift in breeze direction could signal an approaching gale. They watched the waves themselves, noting subtle changes in their rhythm and height that spoke of distant storms or underwater obstacles. The color of the water told stories, pale green indicating shallow sandbanks that could wreck an unwary vessel, deep blue promising safe passage, but also warning of the open ocean's unforgiving nature. Navigation presented perhaps the greatest challenge of all. Without modern instruments, medieval sailors relied on a combination of celestial observation, dead reckoning, and an intimate knowledge of coastal landmarks. They memorized the positions of stars, the patterns of seasonal winds, and the distinctive profiles of distant headlands. Experienced captains could determine their approximate position by tasting seawater, recognizing the subtle differences in salinity and temperature that mark different ocean regions. But perhaps their most crucial survival skill was reading the weather itself. Medieval sailors developed an almost mystical ability to predict storms, watching for the subtle signs that modern meteorology has only recently begun to understand. They knew that certain cloud formations meant wind would shift within hours, that the behavior of dolphins and whales could indicate approaching tempests, and that the very smell of the air carried warnings of danger. When storms did strike, survival depended on techniques passed down through generations of seafaring families. Crews would secure everything movable, rig storm sails designed to keep the vessel headed into the wind, and prepare for battles that could last for days. They understood the importance of maintaining steerage way, keeping just enough sail set to maintain control while avoiding being overwhelmed by the wind's power. the psychological demands were perhaps as challenging as the physical ones. Spending weeks at sea in cramped, wet conditions, with constant danger and monotonous food, tested even the strongest minds. Successful crews developed rituals and routines that maintained morale and unit cohesion. They shared stories, sang work songs that coordinated their efforts, and maintained strict hierarchies that prevented chaos during emergencies. Food preservation represented another critical survival skill. Without refrigeration, medieval sailors had to rely on salted meat, hardtack biscuits, and ale that stayed fresh longer than water. They learned to catch and preserve fish during good weather, supplementing their supplies and providing crucial vitamins that prevented scurvy. The most experienced crews knew which seaweeds were edible, how to collect rainwater efficiently, and even how to extract drinking water from fish in desperate circumstances. Ship maintenance at sea required constant vigilance and ingenuity. Crews carried supplies of pitch, oakum, and spare canvas to patch holes and repair damage. They understood how to reinforce weakened masts with spare rope, how to pump out water when the hull was breached, and how to jury-rig emergency steering systems when rudders were damaged. Every sailor was expected to be part carpenter, part rope worker, and part emergency engineer. The social dynamics aboard medieval vessels were carefully structured to maximize survival chances. Captains held absolute authority during emergencies, but successful skippers also understood the importance of consulting experienced crew members and maintaining crew loyalty. They knew that a crew's willingness to follow orders without question during a crisis could mean the difference between survival and disaster. Perhaps most remarkably, these medieval mariners developed sophisticated signaling systems that allowed ships to communicate across vast distances. They used flags, sail configurations, and even smoke signals to share information about weather conditions, navigation hazards, and safe harbors. Experienced sailors could read these signals from miles away, creating informal networks that helped vessels avoid danger and find assistance when needed. The tools and equipment that enabled their survival were marvels of practical engineering. Their anchors, designed to hold fast in various sea-bottom conditions, could mean the difference between riding out a storm safely and being driven onto rocky shores. Their rope work was an art form, with specific knots and splices designed for different conditions and loads. Even their clothing was specially adapted, with oiled wool garments that provided warmth even when wet, and boots designed to provide grip on slippery decks. Medieval sailors also developed remarkable techniques for dealing with the constant threat of fire aboard wooden ships. They understood how to fight fires with sand, wet canvas, and even seawater, and they organized their vessels to minimize fire risks while maintaining the ability to cook food and provide warmth during cold voyages. The navigation techniques they developed were surprisingly sophisticated, combining mathematical principles with practical observation. They used lead lines to measure water depth and identify bottom conditions, helping them determine their position relative to known coastal features. They understood how to use the sun's position, not just for direction finding, but for determining latitude, and they developed methods for estimating speed and distance traveled that were remarkably accurate. But beyond all these technical skills, medieval sailors possessed something that no amount of modern technology can replace: an intimate, almost spiritual connection to the sea itself. They understood that survival depended not just on fighting the ocean, but on working with it, reading its moods and responding accordingly. They developed an intuitive sense for when to push forward and when to seek shelter, when to take risks, and when to play it safe. The stories of their survival against impossible odds continue to inspire us today. Tales of crews who navigated by stars through weeks of storms, who repaired catastrophic damage with nothing but ingenuity and determination, who shared their last water rations while still maintaining hope of rescue. These weren't just lucky escapes. They were triumphs of human knowledge, courage and cooperation in the face of nature's ultimate test. As we drift off to sleep tonight, let us remember these brave souls who challenged the medieval seas with nothing but wooden ships and iron wills. Their legacy lives on in every sailor who still reads the sky for weather signs, in every captain who understands that true seamanship means respecting the ocean's power while never surrendering to it. The wisdom of these ancient mariners extended far beyond mere navigation and weather reading. When storms did strike with their full fury, medieval sailors had developed an arsenal of techniques that could mean the difference between life and death in the churning chaos of the open sea. Picture yourself aboard a merchant vessel in the North Sea as black clouds gather on the horizon. The wind begins to howl through the rigging with an otherworldly voice, and mountainous waves start building like moving hills of dark water. This is when centuries of hard-won knowledge would be put to the ultimate test. The first priority was always to secure the ship itself. Sailors would work with desperate efficiency to batten down every hatch, lash down anything that could become a deadly projectile, and reef the sails to prevent them from being torn to shreds by the screaming wind. They knew that a single loose barrel or coil of rope could become a bone-crushing weapon as the ship pitched and rolled in the storm's grip. But perhaps their most crucial survival technique was something called heaving to. When the storm became too violent to make any forward progress, experienced sailors would set their sails and rudder in a specific configuration that would cause the ship to essentially pause in the water, riding out the waves rather than fighting them. It was like teaching the vessel to dance with the storm instead of wrestling against its overwhelming power. Medieval sailors also understood the critical importance of maintaining their strength during these ordeals. They would ration their food and fresh water with mathematical precision, knowing that a storm could trap them for days or even weeks. They carried hardtack, a nearly indestructible biscuit that could last for months, and salted meat that provided essential protein when fresh food was impossible to obtain or prepare. When it came to navigation during storms, these mariners relied on techniques that seem almost supernatural to our modern minds. They could estimate their position by the color and temperature of the water, the behavior of seabirds, and even the smell of the air. Some claimed they could taste the nearness of land in the salt spray, detecting the subtle difference between deep ocean water and coastal currents. The construction of their vessels themselves was a testament to survival engineering. Medieval ships were built with flexibility in mind, designed to bend and flex with the waves rather than resist them rigidly. The hull planks were carefully overlapped and sealed with oakum and tar, creating a shell that could twist and move while maintaining its watertight integrity. Even if water did breach the hull, sailors were masters of emergency repairs, using everything from sailcloth to wooden plugs to keep their ships afloat. Fire was perhaps the most dreaded enemy aboard these wooden vessels. Yet medieval sailors had developed sophisticated methods for prevention and control. They created designated cooking areas lined with sand and metal, established strict protocols for handling flames, and maintained emergency supplies of wet sand and leather fire blankets. Some ships even carried primitive fire engines, essentially large syringes that could spray water with considerable force. The social dynamics aboard ship were equally crucial for survival. Medieval sailors operated under a strict but fair hierarchy, where every man knew his role and could depend on his shipmates. They developed elaborate systems of watches that ensured the ship was always properly manned, and they shared knowledge freely, understanding that the survival of one depended on the survival of all. These remarkable seafarers also possessed an intimate knowledge of the sea's moods and personalities. They could read the subtle signs that preceded dangerous weather, from the particular way clouds formed on the horizon to the restless behavior of dolphins and whales. They knew which winds brought clear sailing and which carried the seeds of destruction. When death did claim members of their crew, Medieval sailors had developed rituals and practices that helped maintain morale and prevent the spread of disease. Bodies were quickly but respectfully committed to the sea, wrapped in sailcloth with weights to ensure they sank rapidly. These ceremonies served both practical and spiritual purposes, honoring the dead while protecting the living. Perhaps most remarkably, these ancient mariners possessed an unshakable psychological resilience that allowed them to face the sea's terrors again and again. They developed superstitions and traditions that gave them a sense of control over the uncontrollable, from lucky charms and protective prayers to elaborate rituals for appeasing the sea spirits they believed governed their fate. Their legacy extends far beyond the techniques and technologies they developed. Medieval sailors embodied a particular kind of courage, the willingness to venture into the unknown armed with nothing but accumulated wisdom, practical skills, and an indomitable spirit. They remind us that human ingenuity and determination can triumph over even the most hostile environments, and that survival often depends not just on what we know, but on how we apply that knowledge when everything seems lost. As we've seen, these remarkable individuals didn't just survive the deadly seas through luck or divine intervention. They developed sophisticated systems of knowledge, honed practical skills to a razor's edge, and cultivated the mental fortitude necessary to face nature's most extreme challenges. Medieval sailors faced death at every turn on treacherous waters, yet somehow they endured. We've already explored how these mariners read the signs of nature and built ships that could weather the storm. We've seen their methods for rationing precious supplies and maintaining order when chaos threatened. But there was another element to their survival, one that went beyond mere technique or seamanship. It was the unbreakable bonds they forged with one another, and the rituals that kept hope alive when all seemed lost. For in those dark hours when the waves towered like moving mountains and the wind howled like the voices of the damned, it wasn't just skill that saved them. It was the knowledge that they were not alone, that their fellow sailors would share their last crust of bread, their final drop of fresh water, that when one man's strength failed, another would take his place at the oar or the rope. Medieval sailors understood something that modern seafarers, with all their technology and safety equipment, sometimes forget. The sea is not just a physical challenge to be overcome through superior tools or techniques. It is a force that tests the very soul, that strips away all pretense and reveals what a man truly is when faced with his own mortality. This is why the bonds between crew members ran deeper than mere professional relationships. They were brothers in the truest sense, united by shared peril and mutual dependence. A sailor knew that his life might depend on the man sleeping in the hammock beside him, just as that man's life might depend on his own courage and competence when the moment of crisis arrived. These relationships were forged in the crucible of adversity. When storms struck and the ship became a wooden prison, tossing helplessly in the grip of titanic forces, men discovered reserves of strength they never knew they possessed. They learned to work together with an efficiency born of desperation, each knowing his role and executing it without question or hesitation. But it wasn't just about survival. In the long, monotonous stretches between ports, when the wind died and the ship sat becalmed on glassy seas that stretched endlessly in all directions, these same men who had fought death together now fought boredom and despair. They told stories, sang songs, shared memories of home and dreams of the future. They created a culture aboard their floating world, complete with its own customs, humor, and traditions. The storytelling was particularly important. In an age before books were common and literacy was rare, oral tradition was the primary means of preserving and transmitting knowledge. Sailors became living libraries, carrying tales from port to port, from land to land. They told stories of sea monsters and mysterious islands, of brave captains and treacherous storms, of fortunes won and lost on distant shores. These stories served multiple purposes. They entertained, certainly, helping to pass the long hours at sea. But they also educated, passing down crucial knowledge about navigation, weather patterns, dangerous waters, and safe harbors. A young sailor might learn more about seamanship from the stories of his elders than from any formal instruction. The stories also served to bind the crew together, creating a shared mythology that reinforced their sense of identity as seafaring men. They were not just individuals thrown together by chance, but members of an ancient brotherhood that stretched back through the centuries to the first men who had dared to venture beyond sight of land. Music played a similar role. Sea shanties weren't just entertainment, they were working songs that helped coordinate the crew's efforts during complex maneuvers. The rhythm of the song matched the rhythm of the work, whether it was hauling on ropes, raising the anchor, or pumping out bilge water. The leader would sing the verses while the crew joined in on the chorus, their voices rising together in harmony that could be heard across the water. But perhaps most importantly, these songs and stories kept alive the connection to home. For many sailors, months or even years might pass between visits to their native shores. In that time, they could easily lose themselves entirely to the sea, becoming rootless wanderers with no anchor except the ship itself. The songs reminded them of who they were, where they came from, and what they were fighting to return to. Religion, too, played a crucial role in the mental survival of medieval sailors. These were deeply devout times, when even the most hardened seafarer believed in the power of prayer and the intervention of divine providence. Before setting sail, crews would attend Mass and receive blessings from priests. They carried religious relics and sacred texts, believing these would protect them from the dangers of the deep. During storms, when human skill seemed inadequate to the task of survival, sailors would pray together, their voices raised in desperate supplication above the howling wind. They made vows and promises, bargaining with God for safe passage. "If you spare us from this tempest," they would pray, "we will donate a portion of our profits to the church, or make a pilgrimage to a holy shrine, or live more virtuous lives." These religious observances weren't merely superstition, though they might seem so to modern eyes. They provided psychological comfort and a sense of purpose that helped men endure unendurable hardships. The belief that their suffering had meaning, that they were part of a divine plan, gave them strength to continue when every rational consideration suggested they should give up hope. The rituals of daily life aboard ship also helped maintain morale and discipline. Meals, though often meager and monotonous, were shared communally and followed established protocols. The ship's bell marked the passage of time, dividing the day into watches and ensuring that everyone knew their duties and responsibilities. Even in the midst of chaos, these familiar routines provided a sense of order and normalcy. Leadership was absolutely critical to the psychological survival of the crew. A good captain was not just a skilled navigator and tactician, but also a master of human psychology. He knew when to be stern and when to be compassionate, when to push his men harder and when to allow them rest. He understood that maintaining hope was just as important as maintaining the ship itself. The best captains led by example, sharing the hardships of their crews rather than seeking special privileges. They were visible during the worst storms, calm in the face of crisis, and fair in their distribution of supplies and duties. They inspired confidence not through bombast or false promises, but through competence and genuine concern for their men's welfare. But even the best leadership could not eliminate the psychological toll of life at sea. Sailors faced not just physical dangers, but mental and emotional challenges that could prove just as deadly. The isolation, the uncertainty, the constant proximity to death, all took their toll on men's minds and spirits. Some sailors cracked under the pressure, becoming lost in madness or despair. They might throw themselves overboard in the grip of some delusion, or become violent and threatening to their shipmates. When this happened, the crew had to deal with it as best they could, often restraining the afflicted man until the crisis passed, or in extreme cases, putting him ashore at the next port. Others found different ways to cope with the stress. Some became fatalistic, accepting that their lives were entirely in the hands of fate and that worrying about the future was pointless. Others became obsessively superstitious, developing elaborate rituals and beliefs designed to ward off bad luck and ensure safe passage. The superstitions of sailors were legendary even in medieval times. They believed that certain actions or events could bring good or bad luck to a voyage. Killing an albatross was considered extremely unlucky, as was sailing on a Friday or whistling during a calm. Women aboard ship were thought to be bad luck, as were bananas in the cargo hold. Sailors would touch iron for luck, avoid looking back at port once they had set sail, and perform countless other small rituals designed to appease the mysterious forces that governed their fate. These superstitions might seem irrational, but they served an important psychological function. In a world where so much was beyond human control, where death could come without warning from storm, disease, or enemy action, these rituals provided an illusion of agency. By performing the right actions and avoiding the wrong ones, sailors could feel that they had some influence over their destiny, even when logic told them otherwise. The bonds between sailors extended beyond their own ship to encompass the entire seafaring community. When vessels encountered each other at sea, it was considered not just polite, but essential to offer aid and assistance. Ships would share supplies, pass along news and messages, and provide help with repairs or medical emergencies. This mutual aid was based on the understanding that today's rescuer might be tomorrow's victim, that the sea was enemy enough without sailors turning on each other. This spirit of cooperation extended to ports as well, where sailors from different ships and nations would often band together for mutual protection and support. They shared information about weather conditions, dangerous waters, and profitable trade routes. They looked out for each other's interests and helped newcomers learn the ropes of seafaring life. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of medieval sailors' psychological survival was their ability to find joy and beauty even in the midst of hardship. They marveled at sunsets that painted the sky in brilliant colors, at the phosphorescent wake that trailed behind their ship on dark nights, at the graceful dance of dolphins playing in their bow wave. They found wonder in the vastness of the ocean, in its constantly changing moods and faces. They celebrated small victories and milestones with enthusiasm that might seem disproportionate to landlubbers. The first sight of land after weeks at sea, the successful navigation of a dangerous passage, the capture of fresh fish to supplement their monotonous diet, all these became occasions for genuine rejoicing. This ability to find meaning and beauty in their harsh existence was perhaps the greatest survival skill of all. It transformed what could have been merely an endurance test into something approaching a meaningful life. It allowed men to not just survive their voyages, but to thrive in their chosen profession despite its dangers and hardships. The legacy of these medieval mariners extends far beyond their immediate achievements in exploration and trade. They established patterns of behavior and belief that would influence seafaring culture for centuries to come. The traditions of naval discipline, the customs of maritime law, the songs and stories of the sea, all can trace their roots back to these early sailors who first learned how to survive in humanity's most hostile environment. Their example reminds us that survival is not just about having the right equipment or knowing the proper techniques, though these are certainly important. True survival, the kind that allows human beings to not just endure, but to flourish in the face of adversity, requires something more. It requires the ability to form meaningful connections with others, to find purpose and meaning in struggle, to maintain hope when circumstances seem hopeless. The medieval sailors who braved the deadly seas understood this instinctively. They knew that their greatest weapon against the ocean's fury was not any tool or technique, but the unbreakable bonds they forged with their fellow men. In those bonds, they found the strength to face whatever the sea might throw at them, secure in the knowledge that they would face it together. And so, as we consider their remarkable story of survival against overwhelming odds, we are reminded that the human spirit, when properly nurtured and supported, is capable of enduring almost anything. The sea may be vast and terrible, but the courage and determination of those who sail upon it can be equally immense. Medieval sailors didn't just survive the deadly seas through luck or prayer alone. They had developed a sophisticated arsenal of techniques, knowledge, and mental fortitude that kept them alive when nature unleashed her full fury. But beyond the practical skills of seamanship lay something deeper, something that separated those who perished from those who endured. It was the understanding that survival on the open ocean required not just strong hands and sharp eyes, but an unbreakable spirit forged in the crucible of shared hardship. The bonds between sailors ran deeper than mere friendship or professional cooperation. They were lifelines in the truest sense, connections that could mean the difference between life and death when the waves towered like mountains and the wind howled like banshees. These men had learned that no sailor, no matter how skilled or experienced, could survive alone against the vast indifference of the sea. They needed each other not just for the physical demands of working the ship, but for the psychological strength to endure months of isolation, constant danger, and the ever-present specter of death. When storms struck with biblical fury, when the ship groaned and creaked as if it might split apart at any moment, when green water crashed over the deck and threatened to sweep everything into the abyss, it was this brotherhood that sustained them. The experienced sailors would grab the younger ones, shouting instructions over the roar of the wind, their voices carrying not just commands, but reassurance. "Stay with me, lad." These weren't just orders. They were promises that no one would be left behind, that they would face whatever came together. The rituals and traditions that governed life aboard ship weren't mere superstition or quaint customs. They were carefully evolved practices designed to maintain morale and unity when everything else seemed to be falling apart. The evening prayers weren't just about seeking divine protection, though that was certainly part of it. They were moments when the crew came together as one voice, reminding themselves that they were part of something larger than their individual fears and struggles. The shared recitation of familiar words created a sense of continuity and purpose that could anchor a man's spirit when the physical world around him had become chaos. The songs they sang while working weren't just to pass the time or coordinate their efforts, though they served those purposes too. They were expressions of collective identity, declarations that these men belonged to an ancient brotherhood of those who had chosen to make their living from the sea. When hauling on the lines or raising the anchor, their voices would rise together in rhythms that had been passed down through generations. These work songs carried the accumulated wisdom and experience of countless sailors who had faced the same challenges, the same fears, the same moments of triumph and despair. The stories they told during the long watches weren't mere entertainment, though they certainly helped pass the endless hours of vigilance. They were repositories of practical knowledge disguised as tales of adventure and wonder. A story about a sailor who survived a shipwreck might contain crucial information about reading weather signs or finding fresh water on a deserted island. A tale of a crew that outwitted pirates could teach valuable lessons about navigation and seamanship. These stories preserved the collective memory of the sailing community, ensuring that hard-won knowledge wouldn't be lost when individual sailors met their end. The sharing of food and drink aboard ship followed strict codes that had nothing to do with naval regulations, and everything to do with survival. When provisions ran low, as they inevitably did on long voyages, the equitable distribution of what little remained could mean the difference between a crew that held together and one that descended into violence and chaos. The officer who made sure the youngest sailor got his fair share of the last hardtack wasn't just being kind. He was maintaining the social fabric that kept the ship functioning as a unified entity rather than a collection of desperate individuals. The respect shown to the dead when a sailor was lost to the sea wasn't just about honoring the departed, though that was certainly important to men who lived with constant reminders of their own mortality. It was about affirming the value of every life aboard the ship, reassuring the survivors that their own deaths wouldn't go unnoticed or unmarked. When they gathered on deck to commit a shipmate's body to the deep, they were participating in a ritual that strengthened the bonds between the living, while acknowledging the price that the sea sometimes demanded. The trust that developed between sailors who had weathered storms together was unlike anything found on land. It was a trust born of absolute dependence, of moments when your life literally hung on whether your shipmate would hold the line or let it slip. This wasn't the casual trust of friendship or business partnership, but something far more profound and unbreakable. Men who had pulled each other back from the brink of death, who had shared their last drop of water or their final crust of bread, formed bonds that transcended the normal boundaries of human relationship. The knowledge they accumulated wasn't just technical, though their understanding of winds and currents, of sail trim and ship handling, was certainly crucial to their survival. They developed an almost mystical sensitivity to the moods and rhythms of the sea, an ability to read the subtle signs that could warn of approaching danger or reveal opportunities for safe passage. They learned to interpret the color of the water, the shape of the clouds, the behavior of seabirds, the feel of the wind on their faces. This knowledge couldn't be found in any book or chart. It had to be earned through years of careful observation and painful experience. The courage they displayed wasn't the flashy heroism of battlefield glory, but something quieter and more enduring. It was the courage to climb the rigging in a howling gale, knowing that one slip meant certain death. It was the courage to stand watch through the long dark hours of the night, alone with their thoughts and fears while their shipmates slept below. It was the courage to face each new day, knowing that it might be their last, yet still finding the strength to do their duty and care for their brothers. But perhaps most importantly, these medieval sailors understood that survival wasn't just about staying alive. It was about remaining human in circumstances that could easily strip away all dignity and compassion. They developed elaborate codes of honor and behavior that governed how they treated each other, how they shared resources, how they made decisions in times of crisis. These weren't written rules imposed by authority, but organic principles that emerged from their collective wisdom about what it took to maintain a functioning community in the face of constant adversity. The way they welcomed new sailors into their ranks revealed the depth of their understanding about human nature and social dynamics. They knew that a crew was only as strong as its weakest member, that the frightened boy on his first voyage could either become a valuable addition to their brotherhood or a dangerous liability. So they developed rituals and traditions for bringing newcomers into the fold, for teaching them not just the technical skills they would need, but the attitudes and values that would make them trustworthy shipmates. The respect they showed for the sea itself was both practical and spiritual. They understood that the ocean wasn't just an obstacle to be overcome or a resource to be exploited, but a living entity with its own power and personality. They developed elaborate superstitions and taboos around their interactions with the sea, not because they were primitive or ignorant, but because they recognized that maintaining the proper relationship with this vast force was essential to their survival. They knew that arrogance or disrespect could be fatal, that the sea demanded humility and reverence from those who dared to venture upon its surface. Their legacy extends far beyond the immediate practical knowledge of how to survive at sea. They demonstrated that human beings are capable of extraordinary resilience and cooperation when faced with challenges that seem insurmountable. They showed that even in the most dire circumstances, people can maintain their humanity and care for one another. They proved that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to act in spite of fear when duty and loyalty demand it. The lessons they learned about leadership and fellowship, about the balance between individual initiative and collective responsibility, about the importance of tradition and ritual in maintaining social cohesion, remain relevant today. Their understanding that true strength comes not from dominating others, but from lifting each other up, that survival depends not on individual prowess, but on mutual support and shared sacrifice, offers wisdom that transcends the specific challenges of medieval seafaring. In the end, what allowed medieval sailors to survive the deadly seas wasn't just their knowledge of winds and tides, their skill with rope and sail, or their ability to read the signs of approaching storms. It was their recognition that the greatest force for survival was the unbreakable bond between human beings who had chosen to face the unknown together. Weathering the storm, survival in the unforgiving seas. Medieval sailors possessed an extraordinary arsenal of survival techniques that enabled them to endure the brutal realities of life at sea. These hardy mariners had learned through generations of hard-won experience that success depended not merely on nautical skill, but on an intricate web of practical knowledge, psychological resilience, and an almost mystical understanding of the ocean's temperament. Among the most critical survival skills was the ability to read and interpret weather patterns with uncanny accuracy. Veteran sailors could sense approaching storms hours before they materialized on the horizon. They studied the subtle shifts in wind direction, the particular quality of light filtering through clouds, and the behavior of seabirds as harbingers of atmospheric change. A sudden drop in air pressure would cause experienced mariners to immediately begin securing loose equipment and preparing for rough seas ahead. The construction of medieval vessels themselves reflected centuries of accumulated wisdom about surviving oceanic fury. Ships were built with flexible joints that could bend and twist with the waves, rather than fighting against them. The overlapping planks of clinker-built hulls allowed the vessel to flex like a living creature, absorbing the tremendous forces exerted by mountainous swells. Multiple layers of waterproofing using tar, oakum, and animal fat kept the worst of the sea at bay, though constant bailing remained a fact of life aboard any vessel. When storms did strike, survival depended on a complex choreography of seamanship that had been refined over generations. Sailors would immediately reduce sail area, often stripping the vessel down to bare poles if necessary. They learned to run before the wind when possible, using sea anchors or drogues to maintain control and prevent the ship from broaching in heavy following seas. The most experienced captains knew when to heave to, positioning the vessel at an angle that allowed it to ride over the waves rather than ploughing through them. Emergency repairs at sea required both ingenuity and courage that would seem superhuman by modern standards. Sailors regularly worked in conditions that would terrify contemporary mariners, scrambling up ice-covered rigging in howling gales to repair torn sails or secure loose yards. They carried with them an assortment of tools and materials specifically designed for emergency situations: spare canvas, lengths of rope, wooden plugs for hull breaches, and the knowledge to fashion emergency steering gear from broken spars and sailcloth. The psychological dimension of survival was equally crucial. Medieval sailors developed elaborate rituals and superstitions that served the vital function of maintaining morale and group cohesion during the darkest moments. Shared songs, stories, and religious observances created bonds of brotherhood that could mean the difference between life and death when every man's survival depended on his shipmate's dedication. The telling of tales during long watches served not merely as entertainment, but as a way of passing down crucial knowledge about navigation, weather prediction, and emergency procedures. Food and water preservation represented another realm of specialized knowledge that separated successful voyages from disasters. Sailors learned to recognize the signs of spoilage in salt pork and hardtack, and they developed techniques for stretching meager rations during extended passages. They knew which types of seaweed could supplement their diet, how to catch and prepare fish in rough seas, and most critically, how to collect and store fresh water during rainstorms. The ability to ration water effectively often determined whether a crew would survive to see port again. Navigation without modern instruments required an almost supernatural sensitivity to the sea's moods and patterns. Medieval mariners could read the color and behavior of waves to determine proximity to land, interpret the flight patterns of different seabird species to gauge direction and distance from shore, and use the smell of the wind to detect the presence of vegetation or fresh water. They memorized the positions of stars with religious devotion, knowing that this celestial knowledge might be their only guide home through uncharted waters. Perhaps most remarkably, these sailors developed an understanding of ocean currents and tidal patterns that allowed them to work with the sea's natural forces rather than against them. They learned to use favorable currents to extend their range and conserve precious supplies, and they could predict tidal changes with remarkable accuracy based on the moon's phase and position. This knowledge, passed down through oral tradition and hard experience, represented a form of oceanographic wisdom that wouldn't be formally codified for centuries. The bonds forged between crew members during these trials created a unique form of maritime brotherhood that transcended the normal social hierarchies of medieval society. In the face of nature's fury, noble birth mattered less than seamanship, and the youngest sailor who could tie a proper knot in a gale might be more valued than a lord who couldn't tell port from starboard. This democratic aspect of survival at sea created a culture where competence and courage were the ultimate currencies. These medieval mariners also developed sophisticated methods for dealing with the constant threat of shipwreck. They knew how to construct makeshift rafts from broken spars and empty barrels, how to signal for rescue using mirrors or fires, and how to survive in the water for extended periods using inflated animal bladders as flotation devices. Part 6. The Mind-Forged Manacles. The treacherous seas were only half the battle for medieval sailors. While storms and currents threatened their vessels, an even more insidious enemy lurked within the confines of their own minds. The psychological warfare waged by months at sea, the crushing isolation, and the constant spectre of death created a different kind of tempest altogether. Picture this. You're 3 months into a voyage that was supposed to take 6 weeks. Your fresh water tastes like copper and algae. The last of the salt pork went rancid a fortnight ago. Every morning you wake to the same endless expanse of grey water stretching to every horizon, and every night you fall asleep to the same creaking timbers and the same faces of men who've started talking to themselves in hushed whispers. The human mind, it turns out, wasn't designed for this kind of prolonged sensory deprivation and stress. Medieval sailors developed what we might recognize today as severe depression, anxiety, and in extreme cases, complete psychological breaks from reality. But they had their own names for these afflictions. They called it sea madness or the Blue Devils, and every experienced sailor knew the signs. First came the melancholy. Men would stare out at the water for hours without blinking, their eyes taking on a glassy, distant quality. They'd stop participating in conversations, stop singing the work songs that helped coordinate their labor, stop caring about their appearance or basic hygiene. The old salts recognized this as the beginning stages of what could become something far more dangerous. Then came the hallucinations. Sailors would swear they could see land on the horizon when there was nothing but empty ocean. They'd hear voices calling their names from beneath the waves, sometimes the voices of wives and children they'd left behind, sometimes the voices of shipmates who died on previous voyages. Some would claim to see great cities rising from the depths, complete with towers and bells and people walking the streets. Men in the grip of this particular madness would become convinced that their salvation lay not on the ship, but in the water itself. They'd attempt to throw themselves overboard, absolutely certain that they could walk on the waves, or that mermaids were waiting to carry them to paradise beneath the surface. Smart captains learned to watch for these warning signs like hawks. They'd assign the most melancholic sailors to work in pairs, never allowing them to stand watch alone. They'd rotate duties to prevent any one man from spending too much time staring at the endless water, and they'd encourage the telling of stories, the playing of games, anything to keep the mind engaged and active. But perhaps the most effective weapon against sea madness was ritual and routine. Medieval sailors developed elaborate systems of customs and ceremonies that served as psychological anchors in the formless void of ocean life. Every day had its prescribed activities, its expected rhythms, its small ceremonies that marked the passage of time and maintained a sense of purpose and community. The morning watch would begin with prayers and the checking of the wind. The noon observation of the sun wasn't just about navigation, it was a daily ritual that connected the crew to the larger cosmos, reminding them that they were still part of a world that extended beyond their wooden prison. Evening brought its own ceremonies, the sharing of the day's ration of beer or wine, the telling of stories, the singing of songs that had been passed down through generations of seafaring men. These weren't just quaint traditions, they were sophisticated psychological survival techniques. The stories served multiple purposes beyond mere entertainment. They preserved essential knowledge about navigation, weather patterns, and seamanship. They maintained cultural connections to home and family, and perhaps most importantly, they provided a framework for understanding and coping with the hardships of sea life. Consider the story of St. Elmo's fire, that eerie electrical phenomenon that would sometimes dance along the rigging during storms. To a modern observer, it's simply an atmospheric electrical discharge. But to medieval sailors, it was the visible manifestation of Saint Erasmus, the patron saint of sailors, come to protect them during their darkest hours. This wasn't ignorance, it was adaptive psychology. By transforming a frightening natural phenomenon into evidence of divine protection, sailors could maintain hope and courage in situations that might otherwise drive them to despair. The same psychological wisdom informed their approach to death at sea. When a shipmate died, he couldn't simply be forgotten or ignored. The grief and fear such deaths generated could spread through a crew like plague if not properly addressed. So sailors developed elaborate funeral rites that honored the dead while reinforcing the bonds among the living. The body would be sewn into a canvas shroud, weighted with stones or iron. But before the burial, there would be a ceremony. The captain would speak words over the deceased, not just prayers for his soul, but recollections of his service, his character, his contributions to the crew. Other sailors would share memories, tell stories, sometimes sing songs that the dead man had been known to favor. Then came the moment of commitment to the deep. As the body slipped beneath the waves, the crew would observe a moment of silence, followed by a toast to their fallen comrade. This wasn't mere sentimentality, it was a way of processing grief collectively, of maintaining morale in the face of mortality, of transforming the horror of death into something meaningful and even beautiful. But the most insidious psychological challenge wasn't the dramatic crisis of storms or death. It was the slow, grinding erosion of hope that came with voyages that stretched far beyond their expected duration. When the wind died and left ships becalmed for weeks at a time, when provisions ran low and there was no sign of land, when the carefully calculated navigation proved wrong and no one knew exactly where they were, that's when the real test of mental fortitude began. Experienced sailors knew that this was when leadership mattered most. A captain who could maintain confidence and authority, even when privately terrified, could keep his crew from descending into panic or mutiny. The best captains were natural psychologists, men who understood that their most important cargo wasn't the goods in the hold, but the morale and sanity of their crew. They'd maintain the fiction of certainty even when uncertainty reigned. They'd continue to issue orders with confidence, continue to maintain discipline and routine, continue to project the image of men who knew exactly what they were doing and where they were going. And perhaps most importantly, they'd control the flow of information, sharing good news immediately, while carefully managing how and when they revealed setbacks or dangers. The relationship between captain and crew in these extreme circumstances was unlike anything found on land. It required a delicate balance of authority and intimacy, of distance and accessibility. A captain had to be father, priest, and commander all at once. He had to be strong enough to make life and death decisions, but human enough that his men could trust him with their fears and doubts. Some captains achieved this through sheer force of personality, men whose confidence was so absolute that it became contagious. Others relied on expertise, demonstrating such mastery of seamanship and navigation that their crews had no choice but to trust their judgment. The wisest combined both approaches, projecting strength while remaining approachable, maintaining authority while showing genuine care for their men's welfare. The psychological pressures weren't limited to the common sailors. If anything, the burden on captains and officers was even greater. They carried not just their own fears, but the weight of responsibility for every soul aboard. They had to make decisions with incomplete information, often choosing between options that all carried terrible risks. They had to project confidence they didn't feel, maintain hope when despair seemed more rational, and bear the guilt when their choices led to suffering or death. Many captains developed their own psychological coping mechanisms. Some turned to religion with an intensity that bordered on mysticism, spending hours in prayer and finding in their faith a source of strength that mere human will couldn't provide. Others became obsessive about routine and detail, finding in the precise execution of naval protocol a way to maintain control when everything else seemed chaotic. The most successful captains learned to see their crews not just as laborers, but as complex human beings with individual needs, fears, and motivations. They'd learn the names and backgrounds of every man aboard, understand their family situations, their debts, their dreams. This wasn't mere kindness, it was practical psychology. A captain who understood what motivated each of his men could more effectively maintain morale and prevent the kind of despair that led to mutiny or madness. They'd also learn to read the subtle signs of psychological distress before they became dangerous. The sailor who'd grown too quiet, the man who'd started hoarding his food rations, the crew member who'd begun talking obsessively about home. These were early warning signs that required intervention before they escalated into crisis. Sometimes that intervention was as simple as reassigning duties, moving a man away from isolation and into work that required cooperation with others. Sometimes it meant engaging him in conversation, drawing out his fears and addressing them directly. And sometimes it meant taking more dramatic action, confining a man who'd become dangerous to himself or others until the crisis passed. The psychological toll of sea life extended far beyond the voyage itself. Sailors who survived years at sea often returned to land profoundly changed by their experiences. They developed a different relationship with risk, with uncertainty, with death itself. Many found it difficult to readjust to the rhythms and concerns of terrestrial life. The problems that obsessed their families and neighbors seemed trivial compared to the life and death struggles they'd faced on the open ocean. This led to a kind of psychological exile, even when physically at home. Sailors would gather in taverns and tell their stories to each other, finding in these communities of shared experience the understanding they couldn't get from those who'd never faced the sea's challenges. These weren't just social gatherings, they were informal therapy sessions where men could process trauma and maintain connections with others who truly understood what they'd endured. The families of sailors faced their own psychological challenges. Wives would watch their husbands sail away, never knowing if they'd return. Children would grow up with fathers who were strangers, men who'd appear briefly between voyages only to disappear again into the vast unknown. The constant uncertainty, the inability to plan or predict, the knowledge that death could come at any moment without warning. These created a particular kind of chronic stress that affected entire communities dependent on maritime trade. Yet somehow, despite all these psychological pressures, medieval sailors not only survived, but thrived. They developed resilience that seems almost superhuman by modern standards. They learned to find meaning and purpose in work that was by any measure extraordinarily dangerous and difficult. They created communities of mutual support that could sustain them through trials that would break many modern individuals. Part of this resilience came from the very extremity of their circumstances. When survival itself is uncertain, many of the anxieties and concerns that plague comfortable lives simply fall away. There's a clarity that comes from facing fundamental challenges, a stripping away of the non-essential that can paradoxically lead to a kind of freedom. But perhaps more importantly, medieval sailors understood something about human nature that we've largely forgotten in our comfortable modern world. They knew that meaning doesn't come from the absence of suffering, but from the ability to find purpose within suffering. They understood that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite fear. And they grasped that the deepest human bonds are forged not in comfort, but in shared struggle against overwhelming odds. The sea, in all its terrible beauty and power, became for these men a kind of spiritual teacher. It stripped away pretense and illusion, forcing them to confront the fundamental realities of existence: mortality, uncertainty, the need for courage in the face of the unknown. Those who learned these lessons well didn't just survive the sea, they were transformed by it, becoming men of unusual depth and wisdom. The psychological legacy of these medieval mariners extends far beyond maritime history. Their techniques for maintaining sanity and morale under extreme stress, their methods for building and maintaining team cohesion in crisis situations, their understanding of leadership under pressure, these insights remain relevant for anyone facing extraordinary challenges. They proved that the human spirit, properly supported and directed, can endure almost anything. They demonstrated that meaning and purpose can be found even in the most difficult circumstances. And they showed that the bonds forged between people facing common dangers can transcend all the normal divisions of class, nationality, and background. In our modern world, with its emphasis on safety and comfort, we've largely forgotten these lessons. We've traded the harsh wisdom of our ancestors for the soft illusions of security. But the sea remembers, and the spirits of those medieval sailors who faced its challenges with such courage and ingenuity continue to inspire all who dare to venture beyond the safe harbours of conventional life into the vast unknown, where real adventure and real growth await. The mind, it turns out, was both the sailor's greatest vulnerability and his ultimate weapon. But perhaps the most remarkable testament to these sailors' ingenuity was their ability to navigate vast oceans without modern instruments. In an age before GPS or electronic compasses, medieval mariners developed navigation techniques that bordered on the miraculous. They read the seas like ancient texts, interpreting every wave pattern, wind shift, and cloud formation as vital information for their survival. The art of dead reckoning became second nature to experienced sailors. They could estimate their position, by carefully tracking their speed, direction, and time traveled from a known point. Using simple tools like the log line, they measured their vessel's speed by dropping a knotted rope overboard and counting how many knots passed through their hands in a given time. This gave birth to the nautical term knots for measuring speed that we still use today. But dead reckoning was just the foundation. Master navigators could read the ocean itself like a living map. They understood that different waters had distinct characteristics. The color of the sea told stories about depth and proximity to land. Deep ocean waters appeared dark blue or black, while the lighter blues and greens indicated shallower coastal areas. Muddy or discolored water often signaled the presence of river mouths or harbors ahead. The behavior of waves provided another crucial navigation tool. Experienced sailors knew that ocean swells maintained consistent patterns across vast distances, created by distant storms or persistent winds. These swells could guide them even when local weather obscured other navigational aids. More remarkably, they learned to detect the subtle wave reflections that occurred when swells encountered distant islands or coastlines, allowing them to sense land long before it became visible on the horizon. Wildlife served as nature's compass for these maritime explorers. Certain seabirds rarely ventured far from shore, so their presence indicated nearby land. The direction of their flight patterns at dawn and dusk revealed the location of their roosting sites on distant coasts. Schools of fish, floating debris, and even the color and temperature of the water all provided clues about currents, weather patterns, and proximity to land. Medieval sailors also mastered the art of celestial navigation, though their methods were far simpler than later developments. They used the North Star as their primary celestial guide, understanding that its height above the horizon indicated their latitude. On clear nights, they could maintain course by keeping specific constellations in consistent positions relative to their vessel. The astrolabe, inherited from ancient Greek and Islamic scholars, allowed more sophisticated navigators to measure the altitude of celestial bodies. Though these instruments were crude by modern standards, in skilled hands, they could determine latitude with surprising accuracy. The magnetic compass, gradually adopted from Chinese innovations, provided directional guidance even when clouds obscured the stars. But navigation required more than technical skill. It demanded an almost supernatural ability to synthesize countless environmental clues into actionable knowledge. The most respected navigators developed what can only be described as an oceanic intuition, a sixth sense that allowed them to feel their way across trackless waters. These master mariners passed their knowledge through oral tradition, sharing techniques through stories, songs, and demonstrations. Young sailors learned by watching and listening, gradually developing their own sensitivity to the sea's subtle language. This knowledge was often closely guarded, as skilled navigators commanded high wages and crucial positions aboard vessels. The integration of practical navigation with spiritual belief created a unique maritime culture. Many sailors believed that successful navigation required not just skill, but divine favor. They performed rituals before major voyages, carried blessed relics, and maintained strict codes of conduct to ensure supernatural protection during their journeys. Weather prediction became another essential survival skill. Medieval sailors developed remarkable abilities to forecast storms and changing conditions hours or even days in advance. They read the sky like a book, interpreting cloud formations, wind patterns, and atmospheric pressure changes. The color and behavior of sunrises and sunsets provided crucial information about approaching weather systems. Ring around the moon or sun warned of incoming storms. Red skies at night might promise fair weather, while red morning skies often heralded approaching tempests. The behavior of sea animals also provided weather clues. Dolphins playing near the surface might indicate calm conditions ahead, while unusual bird behavior could signal approaching storms. These predictive abilities were literally matters of life and death. Accurate weather forecasting allowed sailors to seek shelter, alter course, or prepare their vessels for rough conditions. The best mariners could sense atmospheric changes that modern meteorology confirms as real phenomena, though they lacked scientific understanding of the underlying causes. The social bonds forged through shared navigation challenges created deep connections among crew members. Successful voyages required every sailor to contribute their knowledge and observations. The helmsman, lookouts, and ordinary seamen all played crucial roles in gathering and interpreting navigational information. This collaborative approach to navigation strengthened the crew's unity and mutual dependence. Navigation also connected medieval sailors to broader networks of maritime knowledge. Port cities became centers of information exchange where mariners shared discoveries about new routes, dangerous waters, and navigational techniques. These informal networks spread innovations rapidly across vast distances, creating a shared body of maritime wisdom that transcended national and cultural boundaries. The economic implications of superior navigation skills were enormous. Merchants who could reliably reach distant markets gained significant competitive advantages. Accurate navigation reduced voyage times, minimized losses from getting lost, and opened new trade routes that brought unprecedented profits. The most skilled navigators became valuable assets, sometimes earning shares in trading ventures rather than simple wages. But navigation was never just about reaching destinations. It represented humanity's determination to push beyond known boundaries, to explore and connect distant parts of the world. Medieval sailors who mastered these techniques were pioneers who expanded the horizons of human knowledge and possibility. Their legacy extends far beyond maritime history. The courage to venture into unknown waters, the skills to find their way across trackless oceans, and the wisdom to read nature's subtle signs all reflect qualities that remain essential for human progress. These sailors didn't just navigate the seas, they navigated the transition from an isolated, fragmented world to the connected, global civilization we know today. As we reflect on their achievements, we're reminded that survival often requires more than just enduring hardship. It demands the intelligence to master complex skills, the wisdom to learn from nature, and the courage to venture into the unknown. Part 8. The Merchant's Gamble. But even as these weathered mariners mastered the physical challenges of the open sea, they faced an entirely different kind of peril that could destroy them just as surely as any storm or rocky shore. The economic realities of medieval seafaring were brutal and unforgiving, a high-stakes game where fortunes could vanish faster than morning mist, and where a single miscalculation could leave even the most skilled navigator destitute and broken. You see, these weren't just sailors embarking on romantic adventures across the wine-dark sea. They were businessmen, merchants, and traders whose very survival depended on their ability to navigate not just treacherous waters, but the equally dangerous currents of medieval commerce. Every voyage was essentially a massive gamble, where the stakes were measured not just in gold and silver, but in human lives and family legacies that could span generations. The investment required for a single trading expedition was staggering by medieval standards. A merchant might need to risk everything he owned just to outfit one ship for one journey. The vessel itself represented a fortune, requiring skilled shipwrights, premium timber, iron fittings, and canvas that cost more than most people would see in a lifetime. Then came the crew wages, provisions for months at sea, navigation instruments, and most crucially, the cargo itself. Picture a Venetian merchant in the 13th century, standing on the docks as workers load his ship with precious goods destined for Constantinople. Bales of the finest Flemish wool, casks of French wine, bolts of English cloth, and chests filled with silver coins that represent his life's work. The total value might equal what a skilled craftsman could earn in 20 years of labor. And all of it, every last piece, was about to disappear over the horizon on a wooden ship that could be destroyed by a single storm or pirate attack. The psychological pressure must have been extraordinary. These merchants weren't just risking money, they were risking their children's futures, their wives' security, their own old age. Many had borrowed heavily to finance their ventures, pledging their homes, their shops, even their personal freedom as collateral. Failure didn't just mean financial ruin, it could mean literal slavery or debtor's prison for themselves and their families. And the odds were never in their favor. Medieval shipping was plagued by losses that would be considered catastrophic by modern standards. Ships simply vanished without a trace, swallowed by storms or pirates, leaving behind only debt and devastated families. Even successful voyages could turn disastrous if political situations changed while they were at sea, transforming friendly ports into hostile territories where their goods would be confiscated and their crews imprisoned. Consider the story of Marco Benedetto, a Genoese trader whose family had scraped together everything they owned to finance a trading expedition to the Black Sea in 1347. The ship was loaded with luxury goods, spices, and precious metals worth a king's ransom. But as they sailed east, they had no way of knowing that the Black Death was already spreading westward along the very trade routes they were following. By the time they reached their destination, half the crew was dead or dying, the ports were in chaos, and their carefully planned trading partnerships had collapsed into panic and quarantine. Benedetto faced an impossible choice. He could try to sell his goods at ruinous prices to whoever would deal with his plague ship, or he could attempt the return journey with a decimated crew and cargo that might be worthless by the time he reached home. Either way, his family's fortune was likely lost. These were the kinds of decisions that medieval merchants faced regularly, where there were no good options, only different degrees of catastrophe. But perhaps even more treacherous than disease or weather were the human predators who haunted the medieval seas. Pirates weren't just criminals. They were often state-sponsored raiders, operating with the tacit approval of rival kingdoms. A Venetian merchant sailing through waters controlled by Genoa might find his ship seized and his cargo confiscated under the pretense of some obscure trade dispute. There was no international law to protect them, no insurance to compensate their losses, no coast guard to come to their rescue. The most successful merchants developed elaborate strategies to minimize these risks. But even their precautions reveal just how dangerous medieval trade really was. They would split their cargo among multiple ships, reasoning that if one vessel was lost, the others might still make it through. They traveled in convoys when possible, though this required complex coordination and shared costs that ate into already thin profit margins. Some merchants employed decoy ships, sending out vessels loaded with worthless cargo to attract pirates while their real treasures followed a different route. Others paid tribute to powerful lords or pirate chiefs, essentially buying protection from the very people who might otherwise destroy them. These payments were just another cost of doing business, another layer of uncertainty in an already precarious enterprise. The financing of these expeditions reveals just how desperate the situation could become. Merchants would form partnerships called commenda, where one partner provided the capital while another provided the labor and expertise. The profit-sharing arrangements were complex, but they reflected the enormous risks involved. A successful voyage might return 3 or 4 times the original investment, but the chances of total loss were always significant. Wealthy investors, including monasteries and noble families, would spread their risks across multiple ventures, essentially creating primitive investment portfolios. But even this diversification couldn't protect against systematic disasters like plagues, wars, or economic collapses that affected entire regions simultaneously. The psychological toll on the merchants themselves was immense. These men lived with constant anxiety, knowing that news of their ship's fate might not reach them for months or even years. They developed elaborate rituals and superstitions, seeking divine protection through prayers, pilgrimages, and generous donations to churches. The Virgin Mary became the patron saint of sailors, not just because of spiritual devotion, but because these merchants desperately needed something to believe in beyond their own limited ability to control their fate. Family life suffered tremendously under these pressures. Merchants might be away for months or years at a time, leaving their wives to manage businesses and households while facing the constant possibility of widowhood. Children grew up barely knowing their fathers, and marriages were strained by the constant uncertainty and separation. Yet despite all these dangers and difficulties, medieval merchants continued to risk everything on these voyages. They had no choice. Trade was the only path to real wealth in a world where land ownership was controlled by the nobility and most occupations offered little chance for advancement. The potential rewards were so enormous that they justified almost any risk. A successful trading voyage could transform a modest merchant into one of the wealthiest men in his city. The profits from exotic spices, precious stones, or luxury textiles could be astronomical, sometimes returning 10 or 20 times the original investment. These windfalls allowed successful merchants to buy political influence, arrange advantageous marriages for their children, and establish family dynasties that could last for centuries. The most successful merchants were those who combined business acumen with genuine seafaring expertise. They understood not just market conditions and trade routes, but also the practical realities of ship construction, navigation, and crew management. They were part businessman, part sea captain, part diplomat, and part gambler, operating in a world where success required mastering skills that most people never encountered in their entire lives. These merchant navigators developed an almost supernatural ability to assess risks and opportunities. They could look at a ship and instantly evaluate its seaworthiness, examine cargo and determine its quality and market value, meet with foreign traders and judge their trustworthiness, all while calculating complex profit margins and risk assessments in their heads. Their success wasn't just about individual skill, though. The most successful merchants built networks of relationships that spanned continents. They cultivated contacts in every major port, maintained correspondence with fellow traders across vast distances, and developed reputations for reliability that could open doors in the most remote corners of the known world. But even the most successful merchants never forgot how precarious their position really was. They had all seen colleagues ruined by single bad decisions or unlucky circumstances. They knew that their wealth and status depended entirely on their ability to continue taking enormous risks in an unforgiving world where failure meant not just personal ruin, but the destruction of everything they had worked to build. This constant tension between enormous potential rewards and catastrophic risks created a unique culture among medieval merchants. They were simultaneously conservative and adventurous, cautious and bold, practical and visionary. They had to be, because the alternative was destruction in a world that offered no second chances and no safety nets for those who failed. The stress of this lifestyle manifested in various ways. Some merchants became obsessively religious, seeking divine protection through elaborate rituals and generous charitable donations. Others became hardened cynics, trusting no one and assuming the worst about every situation. Many developed elaborate superstitions, carrying lucky charms, following complex sailing rituals, or refusing to depart on certain days of the week. Yet for all their anxiety and uncertainty, these medieval merchants were creating something revolutionary. Their willingness to risk everything on distant voyages was building the foundation of global commerce. establishing trade routes that would connect civilizations and exchange ideas across vast distances. They were literally expanding the known world, bringing back not just exotic goods, but new knowledge, technologies, and cultural practices that would transform European society. Their courage in the face of such overwhelming uncertainty was remarkable. These weren't professional adventurers or military commanders trained for dangerous missions. They were businessmen, often from modest backgrounds, who chose to risk everything because they believed in the possibility of a better future for themselves and their families. The legacy of their struggles extends far beyond the immediate profits they earned or lost. Their willingness to embrace uncertainty and risk everything on distant possibilities helped create the commercial infrastructure that would eventually support the age of exploration, the Renaissance, and ultimately the modern global economy. Every time you purchase something that was made on another continent, every time you benefit from international trade, every time you take for granted the complex web of global commerce that makes modern life possible, you're experiencing the distant consequences of those medieval merchants' willingness to gamble everything on the dangerous seas. The medieval seas were truly a realm of death, where even the most seasoned mariners faced perils that would break the spirit of lesser men. By the 14th century, as trade routes expanded and kingdoms sought wealth beyond their shores, sailors had developed ingenious methods of survival that went far beyond mere seamanship. These were techniques born of desperation, refined through countless voyages, and passed down through generations of men who had stared into the abyss and lived to tell the tale. Among the most crucial skills was the art of reading the ocean's moods through subtle signs that landlubbers would never notice. Master mariners could predict storms hours before they struck by watching the behavior of seabirds, the color of distant clouds, and the peculiar way dolphins move through the water. They knew that when gulls flew inland in unusual numbers, when the wind carried the scent of rain from a clear sky, or when the very air seemed to thicken with an electric tension, death was riding the horizon. These sailors would immediately begin securing everything that could move, double-checking rope tensions, and preparing their vessels for the battle ahead. But reading nature's warnings was only half the equation. The other half lay in the revolutionary techniques medieval sailors developed for emergency repairs at sea. When a storm cracked a mast or tore a sail to ribbons hundreds of miles from shore, there was no rescue coming. Sailors learned to splice broken timbers using intricate rope work that could hold under tremendous stress, techniques so complex they required years to master. They developed methods for patching sails using scraps of canvas and a special waterproof thread made from hemp soaked in tar and beeswax. Most remarkably, they created emergency steering systems using spare oars and rope when rudders were damaged, allowing them to maintain control of their vessels even in the worst conditions. The psychological warfare against despair was perhaps their greatest innovation. Medieval sailors understood that fear and hopelessness killed more men than storms ever could. They developed elaborate rituals and traditions designed to maintain morale during the darkest moments. Experienced captains would rotate storytelling duties among the crew, ensuring that even in the midst of a 3-day gale, there was always someone spinning tales of home, of successful voyages, of the riches that awaited them at journey's end. They sang work songs that synchronized their movements and lifted their spirits, creating a sense of unity that could overcome almost any hardship. These maritime survivors also mastered the delicate art of water and food rationing that could mean the difference between life and death on extended voyages. They knew precisely how much water a man needed to survive without going mad from thirst, and they developed techniques for catching and storing rainwater that could sustain a crew for weeks. They learned to supplement their diet with seaweed, fish caught with improvised lines, and even the occasional seabird that could be lured close enough to capture. Most ingeniously, they discovered methods for determining which islands might provide fresh water by observing cloud formations and bird flight patterns from miles away. The construction of their vessels reflected centuries of hard-won knowledge about surviving in hostile waters. Medieval ships were built with multiple compartments that could be sealed off if one section was breached, a principle that wouldn't be widely adopted in modern shipbuilding for several more centuries. The hulls were constructed with overlapping planks that could flex with the waves rather than fighting them, allowing the ships to ride out storms that would have destroyed more rigid vessels. Even the placement of cargo was a carefully calculated science, with heavier items positioned to lower the ship's center of gravity, while ensuring that essential supplies remained accessible even in rough seas. Communication between ships developed into an intricate system of signals that could convey complex information across vast distances. Sailors used combinations of flags, sail configurations, and even the positioning of their vessels to communicate everything from weather warnings to navigational hazards. At night, they employed carefully controlled fires and lantern signals that could be seen for miles, creating a maritime telegraph system that allowed fleets to coordinate their movements and share critical survival information. Perhaps most impressively, medieval sailors developed sophisticated methods for finding their way across trackless oceans using nothing more than the stars, the sun, and their accumulated knowledge of wind patterns and ocean currents. They created mental maps of extraordinary complexity, memorizing the locations of hundreds of stars and understanding how their positions changed with the seasons and latitude. They could determine their approximate location by observing the color of the water, the types of seaweed floating past, and even the species of fish they encountered. This knowledge was so valuable that master navigators guarded their secrets jealously, passing them down only to trusted apprentices who had proven their worth through years of loyal service. The medical knowledge these sailors possessed was equally remarkable, born of necessity in an age when a broken bone or infected wound could doom an entire voyage. They learned to set fractures using improvised splints made from barrel staves, to treat scurvy with certain preserved fruits and vegetables, and to perform basic surgery using tools sterilized in boiling seawater. They understood the importance of keeping wounds clean and dry, and they developed poultices and treatments using materials they could obtain at sea or in foreign ports. Most importantly, they recognized the symptoms of diseases that could spread rapidly through a ship's crew and knew how to quarantine affected individuals to prevent epidemics. The social structures aboard medieval vessels were carefully designed to maintain order and efficiency under the most stressful conditions imaginable. Captains wielded absolute authority, but they understood that their power depended on the loyalty and respect of their crews. They developed systems of shared hardship and reward that ensured everyone had a stake in the voyage's success. Experienced sailors mentored newcomers, creating bonds of mutual dependence that could hold a crew together when death seemed certain. They established rituals for dealing with loss, ceremonies that honored the dead while reinforcing the determination of the living to continue fighting for survival. Even their clothing and personal equipment reflected generations of refinement in the art of surviving at sea. Sailors wore layered garments that could be adjusted for changing weather conditions, with outer layers treated with oils and waxes to repel water. They carried personal survival kits containing essential items like fishing hooks, fire-starting materials, and small knives that could serve multiple purposes. Their sea chests were marvels of efficient organization, with every item carefully secured and positioned for easy access, even in the worst storms. The knowledge of how to handle different types of cargo safely was another crucial survival skill. Medieval sailors understood that shifting cargo could capsize a ship faster than any storm, so they developed elaborate systems of ropes, wedges, and barriers to keep everything in place. They knew which materials were particularly dangerous when wet, which could spontaneously combust, and which could contaminate food and water supplies. The medieval seas were a theater of life and death, where every voyage could be a sailor's last. But those who survived weren't just lucky. They were masters of an intricate web of skills, knowledge, and unbreakable bonds that kept them alive when the ocean itself seemed determined to kill them. The success of any medieval voyage depended on the captain's ability to read both the sea and his men with equal precision. A skilled captain could sense the subtle shift in his crew's morale just as accurately as he could read the darkening clouds on the horizon. When supplies ran dangerously low, and the men began to whisper of mutiny in the shadows between decks, the captain knew that leadership meant more than simply giving orders. He would gather his most trusted officers in his cramped cabin, the ship creaking ominously around them as they huddled over charts by flickering candlelight. These weren't just discussions about navigation or rationing. They were careful negotiations about hope itself. The captain had to balance honesty about their dire situation with just enough optimism to keep his men from despair. Too much truth and the crew might abandon all discipline. Too little, and they would lose trust in his judgment entirely. The most successful captains developed what we might call emotional navigation, the ability to steer their crew's collective spirit through the storms of fear, exhaustion, and homesickness that could destroy an expedition faster than any hurricane. They learned to recognize the warning signs of a crew on the edge, the way conversations would stop when officers approached, the increase in small fights over trivial matters, the hollow look in men's eyes as they stared endlessly at the horizon. Smart captains knew that a well-timed story could be worth more than an extra barrel of water. During the longest, most dangerous stretches of a voyage, when the men's spirits sagged like wet sails, a captain might share tales of other crews who had faced similar hardships and emerged victorious. He would speak of the wives and children waiting at home, of the celebrations that would greet their return, of the respect they would earn for completing such a perilous journey. But perhaps most importantly, successful captains understood that survival at sea required everyone to believe they were part of something larger than themselves. The greatest maritime leaders didn't just command ships, they forged brotherhoods. They created a shared identity where every man felt that his survival was bound up with the survival of every other soul on board. This sense of brotherhood wasn't just inspiring rhetoric, it was a practical necessity. When a sailor fell overboard in rough seas, the decision to risk the ship and crew to save him wasn't just about compassion. It was about maintaining the unspoken contract that held the entire enterprise together. Every man had to know that his shipmates would risk everything to save him, because that knowledge gave him the courage to risk everything for them in return. The most experienced sailors could read these social currents as skillfully as they read wind and tide. They knew which men could be counted on in a crisis and which might crack under pressure. They understood that a crew's strength wasn't just the sum of individual abilities. It was something more mysterious and powerful that emerged from the bonds between them. Medieval sailors who survived multiple voyages had learned to see their ship not just as a vessel, but as a living organism with its own moods and rhythms. They could tell when the crew was working in harmony by the sound of their footsteps on deck, the rhythm of their work songs, even the way they shared their meager meals. And when that harmony began to break down, they knew how to help restore it before disaster struck. This deep understanding of human nature under extreme stress was perhaps the most crucial survival skill of all. Part 11. The Will to Endure. As dawn broke over the storm-tossed waters, the medieval sailor faced a fundamental truth that separated the living from the dead. Survival at sea was not merely about mastering wind and wave, but about mastering oneself. The ocean had tested their bodies with cold, hunger, and exhaustion. It had challenged their minds with isolation, fear, and the constant calculus of life and death. But perhaps most crucially, it had probed the depths of their spirit, searching for that unbreakable core that would either see them through or abandon them to the depths. The successful medieval sailor understood that the sea was not just a physical adversary, but a psychological one. In the endless expanse of water, where days blurred into nights and the horizon offered no comfort, the mind could become either the greatest ally or the most dangerous enemy. Sailors who survived the longest voyages were those who had learned to forge an inner compass that remained true even when their wooden instruments failed and the stars disappeared behind storm clouds. This psychological resilience was built through rituals both sacred and secular. The morning prayers that began each day served not just as pleas for divine protection, but as moments of centering and purpose. The evening songs that echoed across the deck were more than entertainment. They were affirmations of humanity in an inhuman environment, reminders that these men were not mere specks upon the ocean, but bearers of stories, dreams, and the hopes of those who awaited their return. The sharing of tales during the long watches created a web of connection that bound the crew together more surely than any rope. When a sailor spoke of his village, his family, or his dreams of what lay beyond the next headland, he was not just passing time, but weaving himself into the collective memory of the ship. These stories became anchors that prevented the crew from drifting into the despair that claimed so many who ventured too far from familiar shores. Yet the medieval sailor also understood that survival required a delicate balance between hope and realism. The ocean demanded respect for its power, and those who underestimated its fury rarely lived to tell of their folly. The wise sailor cultivated what might be called a practical pessimism, always preparing for the worst while working for the best. They checked their gear twice, secured their supplies thrice, and never trusted a calm sea or a favorable wind to last longer than the time it took to prepare for the inevitable change. This mindset extended to their understanding of leadership and fellowship aboard ship. The successful medieval sailor knew that survival was rarely a solitary achievement. The captain who listened to his crew's concerns, the navigator who shared his knowledge, the cook who rationed fairly, and the common sailor who pulled his weight without complaint, all were essential threads in the fabric of collective survival. When one thread weakened, the entire fabric was at risk of unraveling. The concept of honor among sailors was not merely about glory or reputation, but about the practical understanding that trust was often the difference between life and death. When a sailor gave his word that he would stand his watch, maintain his equipment, or share vital information, he was making a commitment upon which lives depended. This code of mutual reliance created bonds that often proved stronger than blood, forged in the crucible of shared danger and common purpose. Medieval sailors also developed a profound understanding of adaptability as a survival skill. The ocean was a teacher that never repeated its lessons exactly, and those who survived longest were those who could read the subtle signs of change and adjust accordingly. They learned to recognize the difference between the grey of a passing squall and the ominous darkness of a hurricane. They could feel in their bones the shift from a steady wind to the erratic gusts that preceded a storm. They understood that flexibility was not weakness, but the highest form of strength. This adaptability extended to their relationship with the divine. While deeply religious, the medieval sailor often developed a practical theology that could weather the storms of doubt that arose when prayers seemed unanswered and friends were lost to the depths. They came to understand faith not as a guarantee of safety, but as a source of meaning that could sustain them through suffering. Their prayers evolved from simple requests for protection to complex negotiations with fate, expressions of gratitude for survival, and acknowledgements of their place in a vast and mysterious creation. The successful medieval sailor also learned to find sustenance not just in food and water, but in beauty and wonder. Even in the midst of hardship, they could find moments of transcendence. In the play of dolphins around the bow, in the ethereal dance of the aurora borealis, in the perfect symmetry of a sunset that painted the sky in colors that had no names. These moments of beauty became treasures hoarded against the darkness, proof that the world contained more than suffering and struggle. As the years passed and the sailor accumulated experience, wisdom, and scars, he often became a repository of knowledge that extended far beyond the technical aspects of seamanship. He became a keeper of stories, a reader of signs, a counselor to the young and frightened, and a bridge between the world of land and the realm of the sea. His very presence on a ship could serve as a talisman of hope, living proof that the ocean could be survived and that men could return from the edge of the world with their humanity intact. The legacy of these medieval sailors extends far beyond their historical moment. Their understanding of survival as a holistic challenge, requiring not just physical endurance but mental fortitude, spiritual resilience, and social cooperation, offers lessons that resonate across the centuries. They demonstrated that humans could venture into hostile environments, not through conquest, but through adaptation, not through domination, but through respect, and not through individual heroism, but through collective wisdom. In the end, the medieval sailors' greatest achievement was not the mastery of the sea, but the preservation of hope in the face of the seemingly hopeless. They proved that with sufficient courage, wisdom, and mutual support, humans could venture to the very edges of their known world and return with tales that would inspire future generations to push those boundaries ever further. As the cold winds of change swept across the seas that these hardened mariners called home, the final chapter of their enduring struggle against nature's fury was about to unfold. For generations, these medieval sailors had weathered every storm the ocean could unleash. Their knowledge passed down like sacred scripture from father to son, from master to apprentice. They had learned not just to survive the deadly seas, but to thrive upon them, transforming themselves into something more than mere mortals, tossed about by wind and wave. Through countless dark nights when death seemed certain, when towering walls of water crashed over their fragile vessels and the very timbers groaned in protest, these men had discovered something profound about the nature of human resilience. They had learned that survival was not simply about having the strongest ship or the sharpest sword, but about understanding the delicate balance between courage and wisdom, between individual skill and collective strength. Every technique they mastered, every innovation they embraced, every ritual they performed was born from this fundamental truth: that the sea demanded not just respect, but a complete transformation of the human spirit. The medieval sailor who could read the subtle language of cloud formations, who could feel the approaching storm in his very bones, who could navigate by stars invisible to untrained eyes, was no ordinary man. He had become something closer to the elements themselves, attuned to rhythms and patterns that landlubbers could never comprehend. When he watched the flight of seabirds or tested the wind with a wetted finger, he was performing acts of communion with forces far greater than himself. This was not mere superstition or primitive ignorance, but a sophisticated understanding of natural systems that modern science is only beginning to appreciate. Consider the profound psychological transformation required to face the open ocean day after day, knowing that each voyage might be your last. These sailors developed an almost mystical relationship with uncertainty, learning to find comfort in the very unpredictability that would drive other men to madness. They created elaborate systems of meaning around chance and fate, weaving stories and songs that helped them process the constant proximity of death. Their shanties were not mere entertainment, but psychological armor, rhythmic incantations that bound crews together in shared purpose and helped individual sailors transcend their fear. The brotherhood, forged in these circumstances, was unlike anything known on land. When men have faced the abyss together, when they have pulled each other back from the brink of destruction time and again, when they have shared their last morsel of food and their final drop of fresh water, they become more than companions. They become extensions of each other, able to anticipate needs and responses with an almost telepathic precision. This was the secret weapon that allowed small crews to operate massive vessels in conditions that would challenge modern technology. But perhaps most remarkably, these sailors understood something that our modern world has largely forgotten. That true mastery comes not from dominating nature, but from learning to dance with it. They did not see the ocean as an enemy to be conquered, but as a partner in an eternal waltz, sometimes gentle, sometimes violent, always demanding complete attention and respect. Their ships were not fortresses built to withstand assault, but instruments of harmony, designed to bend without breaking, to yield without surrendering. The navigational techniques they developed were works of art as much as science. When a master navigator could determine his position by the color of the water, the smell of the wind, the behavior of fish, and the subtle variations in wave patterns, he was demonstrating a level of sensory integration that borders on the supernatural. These men had trained themselves to perceive the world with an acuity that transformed their vessels into extensions of their own bodies, their crews into extensions of their will. Even their approach to risk was revolutionary. While modern safety protocols focus on elimination of danger, medieval sailors understood that some risks could not be avoided, only managed through preparation, skill, and an almost spiritual acceptance of fate. They developed contingency plans for every conceivable disaster, but they also cultivated the mental flexibility to improvise when the inconceivable occurred. This combination of meticulous preparation and adaptive thinking allowed them to survive situations that would doom more rigid approaches. The legacy of these remarkable individuals extends far beyond maritime history. They pioneered techniques of crisis management, team leadership, and environmental adaptation that remain relevant today. Their understanding of group psychology under extreme stress, their methods for maintaining morale during prolonged hardship, their systems for making life or death decisions with incomplete information, all of these insights have applications that transcend their original context. As we reflect on their achievements, we must also acknowledge the price they paid. These were men who aged rapidly, whose bodies bore the permanent marks of their struggle against the elements. They faced constant malnutrition, disease, and injury. Many never returned from their voyages, claimed by storms, pirates, or simple navigational errors. Yet they persevered, driven by something deeper than mere economic necessity or adventurous spirit. What drove them was perhaps the most fundamental human need of all, the need to test ourselves against the ultimate challenges, to discover what we are truly capable of when everything is stripped away except our essential humanity. In facing the vast indifference of the ocean, these sailors found not despair but purpose. In confronting their own mortality on a daily basis, they discovered what it truly meant to be alive. Their story reminds us that human beings are capable of extraordinary adaptation when circumstances demand it. We can learn to thrive in environments that seem utterly hostile to our survival. We can develop skills and instincts that appear almost magical to those who have never faced similar challenges. We can forge bonds of loyalty and trust that transcend ordinary human relationships. Most importantly, we can find meaning and even joy in circumstances that would seem to offer nothing but suffering and hardship. The medieval sailors who survived the deadly seas were not superhuman. They were ordinary people who discovered extraordinary capabilities within themselves through necessity, training, and an unwavering commitment to their craft and their companions. Their techniques were not magic, but the patient accumulation of knowledge and wisdom passed down through generations of trial and error. Their courage was not fearlessness, but the decision to act despite fear, to continue moving forward when every instinct screamed for retreat. In our modern world, where we are increasingly insulated from natural forces and existential threats, we can still learn from their example. Their story teaches us about the importance of preparation, the value of traditional knowledge, the power of human cooperation, and the resilience of the human spirit. It reminds us that some of our greatest achievements come not from conquering our environment, but from learning to work with it, to find harmony within apparent chaos, to discover strength through vulnerability. As the sun sets on this exploration of medieval maritime survival, we are left with a profound appreciation for what human beings can accomplish when they combine knowledge with courage, tradition with innovation, individual skill with collective purpose. And now, the story ends. Thank you for joining me tonight on the Sleepy History Channel. We've traversed the perilous world of medieval sailors, their knowledge, resilience, and the quiet courage that enabled them to survive the deadliest seas. Until our next journey together, rest well, dream sweetly, and remember, even in the face of vast and indifferent forces, the human spirit learns, adapts, and finds its way forward through cooperation, wisdom, and quiet determination. Good night.